look, I don't know where to start with this speech. It was disgraceful. It was absolutely disgraceful, insulting to, certainly, of course, to all Palestinians, but it's insulting to members of the Labour Party, to members who know or have an idea of what the real truth is. And I do not understand why he did it, but it was a speech that was there to promote what is in essence an apartheid state, a state that has just now called 6 human rights organizations terrorists, 6 Palestinian human rights organizations terrorists, and Keir Starmer is a human rights lawyer. I mean, how can he support a state that does that kind of thing? Look, one doesn't really know where to start. And I felt that this was the sort of speech that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs might have written for Starmer, because it's a classic promotion of stuff which is simply wrong and is there only to give Israel to make it look pretty when it is anything but. So he was wrong on many counts, not just making the desert bloom. This is a notorious expression attributed to Harold Wilson. And as you say, desert? What desert? Where is this desert? I mean, before Israel was created, was there nobody there? Did nobody cultivate anything? Were there no Jaffa oranges, for example? It's really extremely insulting and very, very stupid as well. And I just, looking through the speech, I came across so many things that are simply wrong, simply wrong. He must not repeat this kind of stuff. Let's take an example. Israel is a state that respects the rule of law. Well, what rule of law? We know very well that Israel discriminates between the Jewish citizens and the non-Jews. It's an it discriminates against, that's why it's an apartheid state. Israel is a state that builds settlements. That violates international law. It violates international in many different ways. How on earth is it a state that respects the rule of law? If you look at the other stuff that he said about it tolerates minorities and religions, of course it doesn't. Anybody who has ever looked at the Aqsa Mosque and looked at the way that the Israeli army behaves in the Aqsa Mosque, how it prevents Muslim worshippers, very often between the ages of 15 and 50, from even attending, being able to pray at the mosque, how it prevents Palestinians outside Jerusalem from getting to Jerusalem because they have a very complicated permit procedure that very few of them ever get. Look at the number of churches that have been attacked and burned down by Jewish zealots. This is simply nonsense. There is no toleration for minorities or other religions. Look at the settler terror that is reported widely, the terrorism that these Jewish settlers inflict on Palestinians. How is that either respecting the rule of law or showing any kind of tolerance? The list goes on. He talks about his support for 2 states and that Israel supports it. It does not. The current government, I mean, no Israeli government has ever supported the 2-state solution. But if you look at the current government, the Bennett government, it said there will be no Palestinian state. What can I say? The ambassador, the Israeli ambassador, was actually in the audience when he was giving this talk, is a woman who supports settlement. She is an advocate of settlement. And by the way, she doesn't agree with mixed marriage, that is between a Jew and a non-Jew. So where does that leave Keir Starmer with his Jewish wife? One wonders. Anyway, but for me, really, the main thrust of this, apart from promoting a state which is clearly nothing like the kind of utopia that he was talking about, it's very anti-Palestinian. He's very anti-Palestinian. whether he understands that or not, there is no mention of the appalling catastrophe of 1948, the Nakba, when the Palestinian people were expelled in order for the state that he loves and admires to come into being. That was a seminal event. No acknowledgement of that, no mention of the apartheid practices against Palestinians, which the state of Israel carries out every minute of every day. No mention of the evictions that are currently taking place in an area of Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, where people are being, the attempts to try and get them out of their homes. No mention of the Jewish national state law that was passed in 2018. You know, the Jewish nation state law describes Israel as a state of the Jews, of the Jewish people. Where does that leave the Palestinians? Where does it leave this tolerance of minorities? You know, I don't know how many people know, but in opinion polls in Israel, up to half the population advocates the expulsion of Palestinians from their lands. It actually supports the expulsion of Palestinians. That's what's going on now. I don't really know whether Starmer looks at news or I don't know what he does. Gaza is the most striking example of Israeli cruelty and Israeli ruthlessness to besiege a whole people, to make their lives unutterably miserable. To, you know, there are people I know from Gaza who've never ever been out of their territory, who don't know the outside world except online. So many of them can't even go to swim in the Mediterranean because the Israeli army patrols the coast and can shoot people. I don't really know what to say. Child arrests. You know that the Israeli army quite regularly arrests minors, some as young as 12, in the early hours of the morning without their parents. They're dragged away, they're interrogated, and they're made to sign a piece of paper in Hebrew. They can't read that. They don't have anybody with them. This kind of cruelty is meted out to Palestinian children, not to any other kind of child. And, you know, finally, I want to just say something about this question of self-determination for the Jewish people. Now, this is a persistent theme in Zionist propaganda, in Zionist writings, and it's an idea widely promoted and widely accepted, unfortunately, by a lot of people who don't actually understand what's going on. Starmer endorsed this idea of self-determination for the Jewish people. Now, for a start, self-determination applies to nations. The Jews are not a nation. They are not a nation. You seem to realize that. So that's the first problem. But the second problem with that is supposing a group of people decided that they were a nation. Okay, I often use the example of red-haired people. Supposing red-haired people said they are a separate people, they are a nation. They can call themselves whatever they like. But what they can't do is express their self-determination as a nation in somebody else's country. This is fundamental. He doesn't seem to be aware of that. He says nothing about that. And it is utterly, utterly disgraceful. This stuff about self-determination for the Jewish people must be nailed for good, because it's irrelevant to the fact that you don't express self-determination, whatever you believe about yourself, in somebody else's country and at their expense. That is exactly what's happened in Palestine. That is why the concept of Jewish self-determination is rejected by every Palestinian, anybody who knows anything about the law or understands justice or any of those issues. And what we couldn't help noticing was, of course, having made this atrocious anti-Palestinian, in fact, a racist speech, Starmer tried to stick on a slogan, which I think he was hoping would make him look as if he was inclusive and it was dealing with everybody. And that is this slogan of the Labour Party is pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and pro-peace. It's totally meaningless and really an insult to the intelligence. Was there ever anybody who would have really said of South Africa that they were pro-Afrikaner and pro the Black population and pro-harmony between these two groups? Of course not. It's a nonsense. Israel is no different to South Africa. And really, somebody needs to educate Keir Starmer. And it's the kindest thing I can say about him. You know, this is absolutely disgraceful and insulting and awful speech. Perhaps I ought to say, Crispin, that I myself have received 2 notices of investigation from the Labour Party. I've been a member since 1986. These 2 notices, the first notice told me that I was being investigated for anti-Semitism and taking as the evidence extracts from an article I published about Jeremy Corbyn, which brings in the question of Israel. And then the second notice of investigation looked through my Twitter feed and picked out tweets which were critical of Israel and said these were anti-Semitic and how do I answer? And where that's at is that on both occasions, the first occasion I answered quite strongly. I demanded an apology. I accused the party of being anti-Palestinian. And I made clear that my remarks, my criticisms were of Israel and always were, and that was my right as the victim of the creation of Israel. Anyway, as if I'd written nothing, and what a pity I wasted an effort on it, the second notice of investigation came in with these tweets. So I wrote again and I said, please read my first response. And I just have to repeat to you, I have no case to answer. These are not anti-Semitic. This has nothing to do with Jew hatred. It's to do with criticism of the state of Israel. So that's where that is at. And I thought people might want to know that.
Well, that's very, very interesting that you've faced that. And thank you very much for coming on and telling us what's going on, because we're not getting that from the media. And Jenny Manson from Jewish Voice for Labour is also here, although she needs to go in a minute. So sorry for keeping you for so long, Jenny. I just had lots on. Jenny, are you there? Try again.
I am indeed, and yes, and I'm absolutely. The only thing that's given me pleasure today is coming in after my old friend Ghada, who are in the same constituency. And the other thing that gives me pleasure, rereading this terrible speech yesterday, was he's not winning on this. People know what's happening in the Labour Party and outside. This is an attempt to silence Ghada and others. And I'm coming on to that in a moment, but it's not actually working. If anything, I think it's backfiring. Did you hear the survey that Israel is the second most unpopular country in Britain after North Korea? Okay, I'm going to start with something that's relatively peripheral or small. Keir's final statement, in the final page, under my leadership of the Labour Party, every Jew will count. Well, I want to tell Keir and others, I feel incredibly unsafe in the party. I was at party conference this time where people were cheering on the readmission of Louise Ellman and so on. And I felt frightened when I didn't cheer. I saw people looking at me thinking, who is this person? Shall we beat them up? Joe knows this sort of experience too. And I was attacked at the Liverpool conference. Jews are physically attacked. Jews are not safe. However, and you know the fact that we are being targeted. But I'm going to come on to something much more important in a moment than us. We're okay, really. We, however, are being targeted. The figures are now that 10 out of 11 Jewish officers have been investigated or are being investigated for anti-Semitism. I keep the list, which is secret to me because some people don't want to be named, and there are around 50 investigations of Jews. I mean, how many investigations of Muslims have you heard of for Islamophobia? It used to be that we said that one Jew is being called anti-Semitic in the party would raise questions, but it's, as you said, it's very, very hard to get the media interested. But what this is really about, as we all know, is silencing us, but silencing Palestinians. And we are forgetting sometimes some of the most important underlying points. For example, the continuing use by the Labour Party of the IHRA, I won't call it a definition, the much contested list of so-called guidelines on anti-Semitism. We all know the story. It's now been denounced by the person who wrote it on the back of an envelope. It is a discredited interpretation, but it's being used. And we know why it's being used. The effect is now that if a Palestinian says that he or she were and their family were expelled from, suddenly Israel, in the Nakba, they are called anti-Semitic for saying that. When young Palestinian students were interviewed by Channel 4 News said that they were told they were anti-Semitic for having Palestinian students saying they would feel unsafe. I mean, I am worried, since I had a meeting with, some years ago when I spoke, at a meeting with another Palestinian academic, who said, why are you, Jenny, and Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi and other JVL members invited on this conversation about anti-Semitism? Why are we Palestinians not asked on? Because the effects on us are so much more serious. And by the way, this isn't only happening in the UK, it's happening in America, it's happening in Europe. The attempt to use anti-Semitism to silence the issue of Palestinian and Palestinian allies, the allies of Palestinians and Palestinians themselves. But I'll say one more word about the allies, though. I mean, Ghada knows this too. Thank goodness there are a huge number of Jews in Britain who are horrified and made miserable by this. I sent the article to 2 retired Jewish lawyers, who I won't name now. And one of them wrote back saying, it's sickening, Jenny, don't send me this terrible stuff, which I thought was one way out. So I'm just going to give you a bit more information about what we can do, however, about this. One point arising out of the earlier conversations, not particularly relevant, but do look at the Labour Activists for Justice site. We've had an update on harassment under the Equalities Act, something that Duncan mentioned. And we are taking forward a case relating to harassment, as you'll see. And more information will come about that quite soon. But also, to our amazement, we have had a response from the HRC. We put in 2 submissions. And in law, probably the most powerful argument we made was that we were not consulted in the action plan. We were not allowed onto the advisory board. And we put in, as Ghada will know, a letter to the Labour Party saying also that we should have had a Palestinian involvement in the discussions of the action plan. So we are now going to go back to the HRC, this time with some invitation to say this is why the action plan has gone so wrong. The party hasn't got a clue what anti-Semitism is. They're floundering around. And one of the obvious signs that they'd have no idea is this catch-all claim, this catch-all charge that we're all suffering under, which is undermining the Labour Party's campaign to fight racism. And it's a terribly dangerous clause because it literally means if you question the scale, the content, the method of their investigation, you are making it harder for them to fight racism. I think the only comfort I have in this, and I think Glynis and Duncan would agree with me, is that lawyers of all sorts have told me couldn't be argued in court because it's a meaningless phrase. You know, what is undermining the case? Is it better they know the truth or they don't know about the scale of anti-Semitism? So yes, this is my only thought of hope that we are working together, those who know what's going on in Israel-Palestine, those who know what's going on in the Labour Party are speaking out, and as a cliche, we will not be silenced. And I mean, this sort of group is terribly encouraging, of course, and I think, and I don't know if other people agree, that although it's not the biggest story, but the story about Jews being called anti-Semitic does puzzle and worry people. If we can get that story out there, and I'm continuing to go, I have got contacts from the BBC and the Guardian, but their response, you won't be surprised to hear, is we are being silenced by their editorial board. But we fight on, we fight on. Thank you very much, everybody, anyway. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Jenny, for coming on. Now, another story, and thank you, Ghada. Are you there, Ghada?
Yeah, I am. And I just, by the way, just wanted to say a couple of words. First of all, thank you, Jenny, for giving all that information, which is very important. But one point I really want to make, I'm sure people probably already realize this. I never thought to see the day when the issue of Palestine has become a litmus test for issues of for the left. It's become a proxy for the left. So if you actually support Palestine and the Palestinians, you're bound to be left-wing, and on that count, you will have trouble with Keir Starmer's Labour Party. But I really want to urge people, please, please support Palestine, be on the left and be on the side of justice, please.